You're listening to the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Yes, do you listen to the Paranormal UK Radio Network, Your Majesty?
Oh yes, most definitely, one has. Well, it'd be a very dull world otherwise, wouldn't it?
Welcome to Paranormal UK Radio, created by Aaron Allen and Mark Johnson. Twin Souls is hosted by myself, Philip, along with my twin brother Ronnie Kinsella, in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network. A warm welcome to all our listeners. Now, our next guest needs no introduction, because he truly is my idol, and a very respected ufologist. Phillips Mantle is a world-respected UFO researcher, author, broadcaster and publisher. Philip belonged to the British UFO Research Association back in 1979, and he's lectured extensively on the subject and is considered one of the most prominent and dedicated authors of his time into the UFO phenomena. Hello, Philip.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So what I want to ask, Philip, first of all, is what is it that brought you in? I'm sure the listeners would love to know. What is it that got your interest in UFOs? How did you get involved with this?
Yeah, I mean, looking back to when I was a young lad, I mean, I always had an interest in all things paranormal, and in my days when I was a young lad, the only way to access any information about these subjects was in books and the occasional magazine.
Yes.
I think my mum may have stimulated my interest. My late mother, she was from Northern Ireland. And where my mum lived when she was a teenager was really out in the sticks. I mean, to give you an example, she had to walk 5 miles to go to school and 5 miles back. So they were out in the sticks. And she remembers when she was a youngster, she told me the story of her encounter on the farm they lived, where she met a fairy, complete with pretty clothes and wings, and she had a conversation with it. And she drank out of a bottle, and it stayed with her all her life. And she told that story to my children, and I've told it, since she's died, I've told it to their children as well. So, and my mum was also a great reader, and so our house was always full of books.
Yes.
So, I followed suit. And I read everything I could lay my hands on the paranormal. And, just by chance, my best friend's grandmother used to live the opposite side of the street to us. And to my surprise, and she used to attend the Spiritualist church. So I used to go with her on occasion. I used to go to the Spiritualist church and found it absolutely absorbing and fascinating. I didn't necessarily agree with what they were preaching, so to speak.
Yes.
But nonetheless, I found it interesting, and I had a small interest in UFOs because I think I read maybe 1 or 2 articles about it. So I left school with pretty much no qualifications. The school I went to was hopeless, and then in 1978, of course, in the UK, came the film Close Encounters. And I didn't realize it at the time, perhaps, but that had a real effect. Now, in 1979, I went to work overseas for a short while. I went to work in Germany. Mm-hmm. And my interest grew because we didn't have access to, MTV or anything like that in those days. So I couldn't watch the TV. So basically, whether I would go down the pub, go to work, or read. So I read more books about it. Now, when I came home, my aunt Emily, who lived literally just around the corner from us, she brought along a local evening paper, the Yorkshire Evening Post. I lived about 5 or 6 miles from the city of Leeds in West Yorkshire, and in the small ads was an advertisement for the meeting of the Yorkshire UFO Society the coming Sunday. So I thought, that sounds intriguing. So off I went, and the meeting was being held by two brothers, Mark and Graham Birdsall. They had formed the Yorkshire UFO Society. And this was the first meeting. There was about, 20, 30 people there. And Graham and Mark gave a presentation. They'd already been involved in the subject for a few years. Graham was a few years older than me. Mark was the same age as me. And I just found it absolutely fascinating. And I attended the meetings on a monthly basis and just sat there pretty much for, 5 or 6 months. But to listen to others tell me what was going on and to read about it was never enough, guys. I mean, I wanted to find out myself. I'm the type of chap who, if he sees a machine and then the button says don't press, well, I'd want to press it to find out what happened, And that was the same with the UFO subject. We were also quite fortunate that around about my time of joining with Mark and Graham at the Yorkshire UFO Society, areas in and around the Yorkshire Dales National Park, around the market town of Skipton, which was, only an hour's drive from where we lived, was inundated with UFO reports. And I mean a lot of them, and I mean of every type you can think of. So about the time I was wanting to get more involved, we just happened to have a lot of sightings that I was able to get my teeth into, and off I went, and I just felt this is the place for me. I felt at home. I felt that this is what I was supposed to be doing. And that's how it all started. If my aunt had never shown me that newspaper advert, it would probably have never happened, but it did, and I feel quite fortunate that it happened the way it did. And as you say, the rest is history. That's where it all began.
Yes, and history it was, because you've done a lot of writing. You've also got your own publishing company, Flying Disc Press, and one of the things that I admire about you, Philip, is the fact that when you do your research, you do it meticulously, and I know Ronnie feels the same. Ronnie? Yes, I do. This would have been also the time of the Roswell. You would have probably evidently heard of the Roswell crash that happened in 1947. He wrote about it, Ronnie. Yes, I know. We actually have bought the book. Yes. Your book. We've got the actual book that was done some years ago. We actually managed to get it on Amazon, but that was fascinating. We knew about the main cases like Roswell and others, but obviously in those days we didn't have access to the internet, so it was only the major cases that made it into the headlines from overseas that we really got to know about. Roswell being one of them, of course, but there were others. Yes. And ones that made it into magazine articles. But as we know, as researchers, there are thousands of other cases that never make it into books, that never make it into magazine articles. So we started our own. This is how primitive we were. We started this grand publication called the UFOS Journal. And it was actually made on a hand-cranked Gestetner machine. Good God. And I think we sold it for about 30 pence or something like that. Then, a few years later, we actually bought a second-hand small offset lithographic printing machine, and we had it's about the size of a big filing cabinet, and we had to get that up onto Mark Birdsall's flat, because that was our HQ. He lived on the 7th floor, and we were praying when it was delivered that the lifts were working, because they didn't always work. So off that went, and we didn't know how to use this thing, by the way. We just bought it, and we set Mark the task of learning how to use it, which he did, God bless him, and we printed what became Quest magazine.
then, Quest, I think at its height, we sold about 200 copies. And we still had to hand collate it. And so that was when I started writing. I started writing for these small publications. Of course, Graham and Mark went on to successively publish UFO magazine.
Yes.
Which I think at its peak was selling something like, 40,000 copies per issue.
Yes.
Sadly, the magazine died when Graham died out of the blue unexpectedly a few years back. But that's where it all began. So I'd write a few articles then, and it just went from there. And this was, like I said, the days before the internet. There wasn't that many ways you could find out things other than doing it for yourself.
Yes, I mean, I used to, me and my brother, my twin Ronnie, we used to go down the library every Saturday, and I was researching I think it was about 11 or 10 or something.
Well, they didn't have internet then either.
No. The Roswell case, I was into that, and
yes. and the Kelly Hopkinsville case as well. We've got your book here, Philip. Close Encounters at Kelly and Others of 1955. I remembered reading that account when I was younger, and I was fascinated by it. The goblin creatures, yes, brilliant.
Just tell everybody how great that book looks.
I will tell you this. I was surprised how big it was, and I love the way you've kept the traditional print inside.
Well,
absolutely beautiful.
I did that on purpose. I mean, I remember reading about these cases, and I don't know about you, gentlemen, but I have sat behind me, much to my wife's despair. Our second living room is packed to the gills with UFO stuff, and I have a huge library. And the original Kelly report I've got next to me here, published, in 1978 by the Centre for UFO Studies, and it's all hand done. And I give credit to them, but if they sold a couple of hundred copies, that will have been about it. And I'm fascinated with this case and others like it. And what I've tried to do, and will continue to try and do, is to get permission to republish them. Because, okay, yes, you may be able to find some of these online as PDF files or whatever, but I'm from the old school. And I like to sit and read a book.
Yes.
I'm a Yorkshireman. I'll make no odds about it. If I make a few pounds at the same time, that's fine, because this is what I do for a living now. I don't have a proper job anymore. But that's not my main purpose with some of these reprints that I've started to do. It's to actually put this information back into the public domain and to allow you to sit down and read it and think, geez, because it is part of ufological history. And these were the types of cases that inspired me and got me, out of my chair and out onto the moors and interviewing people, spending time going through. That's before the internet. Again, my local town, I moved to a town called Batley, so I went through all the newspaper cuttings looking for things. So, but it was these cases, as well as some of the local ones and others in the UK that I was personally involved in, that got me going. Yeah. And I'd like to think that it can still have the same effect on others out there today who perhaps weren't as fortunate enough as me to buy a copy of this publication when it came out. Mine's well dog-eared. It's, it's had a good life. It's well read and well loved. And, so I hope to do more of that in the future, but, we'll have to wait and see. But it's a fascinating read. It really is.
Yes, and the other thing is I wanted to ask you, Philip, was in all of your many years as a UFO researcher, is there because I've always wanted to ask you this, is there a particular case that you yourself have found absolutely like wow, or a case where you felt this is it?
Yeah, there's a couple.
Yeah.
There's one in the UK and one in the United States. The one in the UK took place around about the same time I was getting involved in this subject. And to get myself, out there so people knew to contact, I did a piece for my local newspaper, and a lady rang me, and her first words were, "You'll never believe me. You'll never believe me." And I said, "Well, give me a chance. Yeah, you haven't told me anything yet." And she lived just a few miles away, a small town called Normanton. Now, my dad worked down the mines, all his life. Normanton then was still a mining town. The mines have long since gone now, of course. So this was a lady called Mrs. Westerman. And Mark Birdsall and myself went to interview her. And it was not just Mrs. Westerman, but it was 5 of her children as well. Now, on the day that she was talking about was a lovely summer's day. And the children were playing outside. Now, she lived in an elevated house. And she was about 8 or 10 houses from the end of a cul-de-sac. And the children were playing a ball game in the street, and it's the exact same ball game I played when I was their age. So the ball goes up in the air. You see this thing, it was a beautiful day. It came down at an angle, stopped in midair, and landed in some fields adjacent to the cul-de-sac. So they all run in the house, mum, 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 and they said there's an aeroplane crashed in the field. Now, she was still washing the dishes after lunch. Now, because it's an elevated house, she walked out the front door, and she could see right across these fields. And she says, Philip, it was this object was sat there on the ground, and it was shaped like a Mexican hat, but it was like a silver colour. So she got the children, off they went. Now, there's some fields there, and in this field where this thing was, there was electricity pylons. They run out to Ferrybridge Power Station just a few miles away. And at one point, they lost sight of it because you go down a little dip, and come up the other side, and there's a fence borders the field. And now there was 3 tall men stood around this thing, all dressed in white, with a visor on their face. They were so close they could see that they didn't have gloves on. They actually had mittens.
Ah.
So, and they had something in their hand, and they were waving it across the ground. Now, the kids weren't fazed by this at all. They tried to get over the fence, but she held them back. At this point, these 3 men, they didn't call them spacemen, they just called them men. They walked to the back of this thing. It rose up, stopped in the midair, and shot off at an angle whence it had came. And they were astounded. I mean, the one thing she just said, if you know Normanton, it's bordered by 2 motorways. One side is the M62, the other side is the M1. It was a lovely summer's day, and she said, I was sure it was going to be on the TV that evening, and that it would be all over the newspapers the following day. And she was amazed. She even asked some of the neighbours, I believe. Nobody had seen a thing. We even interviewed one of the children's friends. He'd been playing with them that morning, and he'd gone home to have his own lunch. And he'd come back and he'd missed it all. But he told us that, they were all talking about it. They were all excited about it. It's not that fascinating. They weren't abducted. There weren't landing marks. But it's the people themselves now. Mrs. Westerman's husband wasn't there because he was at work in the pit. So these were the type of people that I'd grown up with all my life. The kids were pretty much like I was. I played the exact same ball game they were playing. It's one you make up yourself. And so they were either telling the truth or they were lying. There is no in between here. No. It's not a misidentification. This thing wasn't a helicopter or a hand glider or anything like that. And I couldn't find any reason for them lying. No. So, I had to believe it. And it's almost, guys, that you had to be in that place at that time, almost like in a bubble, and that the incident happened there and then. Yeah. And anyone outside of that, the world went along as normal. It's just something that occurs to me. No one else saw anything.
We mentioned this, is that, Philip and I have seen some UFOs. I was privileged. I wouldn't say it at the time. It was damn scary, but I saw one of the triangular ships. I thought they were a myth or perhaps some kind of military device. But what I saw was not of this planet. And the thing I was surprised about is that it was thick-set and the corners were rounded. They were not sharp. It was thick-set, like you get a number of decks on it. And what you were saying, like the bubble, yes, I think it was Jenny Randalls who coined the phrase, the Oz factor. I think it was her.
She did indeed, yes. Yeah. And it's very apt. And again, when you interview people, you time and time again, they'll say, well, there was no noise, the dogs had stopped barking, and there was no traffic on the road, but normally there is. Yeah. So it seems as if it happened just there and then, and just for you that were there. Yeah. The other incident I mentioned took place on October the 11th, 1973, at a place called Pascagoula in Mississippi in the United States. And it puzzles me and interests me for a whole host of reasons. It involved two gentlemen, Charles Hickson, who was 42 at the time, and his young friend, Calvin Parker, who was 19. Calvin Parker was Charlie's best friend's son. They kind of grown up together. And Calvin originally lived 200 miles away, but Charles Hickson got him a job working on the shipyards on the river. So he'd only been working there for a few days, and he was staying with Charles Hickson. And the one thing these two guys loved doing was fishing. I mean, they were fishing bonkers. So on that day, on the way home from work, they're actually driving by the river and picking out spots where they've got. I mean, this is no beauty spot. It's a place where there's old wrecks. The pier was falling apart. People were going to dump the junk. So it's not some picturesque Mississippi backwater. Anyway, that night, they go fishing. As they're driving into this place, Calvin sees this sign saying, no admittance, but they took no notice of that. In they went. They passed a car that was parked up with somebody in. And they started fishing off an old pier. And one of the reasons they went to the old pier, because it was one of the places that the pier used to load grain. And of course, some of the grain used to spill into the river, hence, fish come and eat it. Like a lot of fishermen, they weren't having a great success. And it was about 9 o'clock in the evening. And they saw this blue light. And they thought, uh-oh, it's the police coming. We'd gone past this no admittance sign, and it's the police. So when they turned around, they were amazed. The grass in those areas at that time was 6 or 7 feet high. That's the type of grass they had.
Yes.
Descending into the grass just a matter of feet away from them, a matter of yards away, was this rugby ball. They call it a football, but it's an American football shaped object with 2 lights at one end, and they were petrified. I mean, Calvin said he looked around for places to run, but there was nowhere to run. Charlie said when his first thought was for his younger companion. And he said, when I looked round at him, I've never seen a man so scared in my life. Bearing in mind, Charles Hickson had been a veteran of the Korean War and had seen active service in combat as well. And so they were, dumbstruck. If that wasn't enough, a door opened. Not that they could see how it opened. They couldn't see any openings. There was just an opening. And these 3 bizarre humanoid creatures came floating. And I mean, when I say floating, I mean floating. Their legs didn't move, and they never touched the ground. They're about 18 inches, 2 feet off the ground. And again, they were the most bizarre-looking creatures. They were about 6 foot tall, grey, wrinkly, coloured, like elephant skin is how they describe it, from top to bottom. Again, they didn't have fingers. They had like mittens or pincers for hands. Their legs never moved, so they didn't part their legs. They didn't run. They didn't walk. They had like stumps for feet. No eyes, no mouth, but instead on their head at the front was a sharp protrusion and 2 big carrots sticking out the side and one on the front. They grabbed Charlie and Calvin, took them aboard this thing, and Charlie said that he was so frightened that he wanted to die. And he said, I thought they were going to kill us, so rather than torture us, he was saying to himself, kill us now. Just get it, just do it now. But then he sort of fell back on his military training, and he remembered being pinned down in combat, and his captain saying to him, just wait, stay calm, and we'll find our chance to get out of here. So that kind of kicked in. Anyway, they were, cutting a long story short, both him and Calvin were deposited back on the riverbank, and woof, this thing was gone. They were staggered along, got back to the car, didn't really know what to do. Charlie left a bottle of booze in there, so he had a mouthful of that. They decided that they weren't going to tell anybody. They thought nobody would believe us, so off they went. But then their conscience got the better of them. They thought, well, what if this is going to happen to someone else? surely we should tell someone. So they found a telephone box. This is 1973. There's no mobile phones. And they phoned the nearby Air Force Base. That was Keesler Air Force Base. A rather tired woman just said the Air Force doesn't investigate UFOs anymore. Ring the sheriff. They were not happy about that. So they took off again, deciding to go home again. Again, their conscience got the better of them, and they pulled into a diner, went in there, got the phone. This time they phoned the sheriff's department, and the sheriff said, I'll meet you at a particular place and I'll escort you back into town. I don't think the sheriff thought they would be there. He thought it was just some kind of wind-up. But of course they were there. They escorted them into town to the sheriff's office at Jackson County. The deputies interviewed both men separately, didn't really believe them, you know. Now, what these two guys had decided is that because Calvin was so young and so frightened, they would say that he didn't remember anything, that he actually passed out.
Ah, right.
And Charlie, the older one, would take it all on his shoulders. So eventually, the police put them both in an interview room together, and there was a table there, and they left them. What these two guys didn't know is that in the table was a tape recorder that was running. The police thought, right, we'll get them now, you know. So they came back in a few minutes later, opened the drawer, took something out. Charlie and Calvin didn't know what was going on. They played the tape back, and of course, they didn't catch them. They were still saying, you know, how are we going to tell our wife and family? You know, what's going to happen to us? Calvin was praying at one point. He was saying his prayers because he was that scared. So, you know, they made an agreement with the sheriff that, you know, nobody would say anything. But of course, the cat got out of the bag, and the press descended on them, and it was a free-for-all. They went back to work the following morning, and they couldn't get any work done for the press. Within 36 hours, probably the most famous UFO researcher there's ever been, Dr. Alan Hynek, flew down.
Yes.
And along with a chap called Dr. James Harder, paid for it himself, you know, self-funded, and he held a press conference after listening to the tape and interviewing the two men and said, you know, they are the genuine article. The following day, they did go to Keesler Air Force Base. Somebody came up with the idea, well, maybe you know, got radiation on you. So they went to the Air Force Base and were checked for it, was negative, but then the personnel there at the Air Force Base did interview them, you know, in depth. And then 3 weeks later, Calvin had disappeared. He'd gone back home, and he ended up in hospital with a nervous breakdown. So, you know, from there, Charlie, like I said, took on the mantle, if you like, of speaking to the press. He went and spoke to one or two UFO conferences down the years. Calvin pretty much kept out of the way. I mean, just before this happened, he got engaged, and he was worried if this got out that his fiance's father wouldn't let him marry her, you know.
Very interesting.
It is a fascinating story. Both guys passed lie detector tests for whatever. Now, again, last year I republished the book UFO Contact at Pascagoula, which is basically Charles Hickson's story, although Calvin is involved in it at the beginning.
Yes.
And
that's the one you've just ordered, Philip.
Yes.
So as part of my research, I was thinking, I knew Charles Hickson had passed away in 2011, and I thought, I wonder if I can find Calvin Parker. Maybe I can interview him and just put an interview with him at the back of the book. And so I eventually did find him, and it took me a good few months to get him to speak. But when I did, I was amazed to find out he'd recently retired and wanted to write his own book.
Wow.
And he had a lot more to say. So, you know, the manuscript for that is now ready. We're just waiting on one or two documents coming in. But Calvin has now told me his side of the story about what happened to him then, about how it affected him and his family, and another encounter they had many years later. Also, for example, in 1993, when he went to Florida to meet Bud Hopkins, who was probably the best-known UFO abduction researcher there's ever been. And Bud put Calvin under hypnosis and regressed him. And we've managed to get a copy of the tape. It was tape recorded.
Wow.
I even had to buy a cassette player to listen to the cassette tape. You know, some of the younger people out there be thinking, now, what's he talking about? A tape, you know? So a full transcript of that will be going in the new book. And I mean, it was fascinating to hear it because I was friends with Bud as well. It was kind of scary at points because you literally hear Calvin screaming while he's under hypnosis.
Yes.
Bud has to calm him down. That doesn't come across, no matter what you say in a transcript. It doesn't come across the same at all, you know. So those are the two cases that really stick in my mind. You know, from one from this side of the pond and one from the other.
Yeah.
And I was
the screaming, that incident with the gentleman, the two chaps, a fisherman, that reminds me similarly of the Betty and Barney case when they, similar events where they were regressed and Barney was screaming. I mean, I've heard these tapes and they are quite unnerving. And I know those two saw something. I think they were the Greys, weren't they? I believe they were the Greys.
Yeah, I mean, it is unnerving when you hear a grown man screaming.
Yes.
You know, and he's not acting. I've heard those same things you talk about Barney Hill. I've heard that as well. And it is quite, you know, disconcerting when you do hear a grown man screaming like that, you know. I don't mean screaming in fun or screaming on the rugby pitch or yelling at your kids, you know, screaming in fear. You know, that's completely different. It really is. Yes. And one of the things I said to Calvin, look, if we write this book, you know, you might be in demand to speak on radio or maybe a conference. You'll have to get used to that. And he said, I'm fine with that now, Philip. You know, I'm at a place in my life when I can deal with that now. He's been ill. He's retired. You know, his family are grown up. And so he's ready to tell all. And there's parts of the tape, you know, and some of the things he says on it, you know, well, I'll leave the readers, hopefully, to make their own mind. We've called it Pascagoula, the closest encounter, because there is the Hynek connection. Sadly, I mean, we've had some great help from the UFO community. I mean, the Centre for UFO Studies gave me their file on it. But apparently, Alan Hynek had his own file, which he took home and it never came back. It was one of the few files he ever took out of the headquarters, apparently. So we've got the files from another group that was involved called NICAP, the Mutual UFO Network, which thankfully is still going. They gave me their file on it. And the other guy that was with Hynek, Dr. Harder, he was part of a group then called APRO. And their files are held with a lady and gent, and we've asked them if we can have access to any files they have on it. Well, that's all we're waiting for. You know, the manuscript is written, and they're not even sure what's in those files. You know, themselves, they're going to have a search of them for us. So, and we've also got interest from a movie producer, director. Whether it comes to fruition or not remains to be seen, but that really doesn't matter. The fact is, later this year, we will have that book out, which follows on really from the earlier one done by Charles Hickson. Yes. You know, these are the types of things that fascinate me, guys. They really are.
I will definitely have to get that when that comes out, because my brother and I are both suckers for UFO literature. We like yourself, we've got this kind of like this nose or this feel for, you know, a lot of the genuine ones, and I know that you will only get involved with those subjects that are genuine, or you kind of like have a nose for what is real and what is not. But I wanted to ask you, Philip, what do you believe UFOs actually represent? There's been a lot of controversy surrounding this. What are your thoughts about the UFO phenomena itself? Do you think they're coming from another planet or another dimension? What's your thoughts?
Well, it's a very difficult question. I mean, when I first began, I'd no doubt that we were dealing with aliens from wherever. However, down the decades, I've been involved for 40 years now.
Yes.
I started when I was 20. I'm now 60, and you know, my opinions have changed rapidly. and continue to develop, if you like, or evolve might be a better way. I think the simple extraterrestrial hypothesis that aliens are coming from A to B by some means, it doesn't really fit the evidence that we have. It really doesn't, because there are times when UFOs, to all intents and purposes, would seem physical nuts and bolts things, and you could hit it with an hammer and it would go dink. But there are other times when they don't. They seem, and I'll put this in inverted commas, paranormal by nature. The aliens can move through solid matter. The UFO will land, but it doesn't bend a blade of grass. When it's gone, there's no mark it's ever been there. So it doesn't appear physical at all. Or it will not appear on radar. Sometimes they will appear on radar. And then if you look at ufology from the modern era, from 1947 right through to today, you can see, guys, how it's evolved. It hasn't remained the same. You had the simple flying saucers or flying discs, whatever you want to call them, of Kenneth Arnold's era. In the 1950s, you had the Space Brothers. Where have the Space Brothers gone? Where have they gone? And the 60s, you started with the first abductions. The little guys that Betty and Barney Hill met were wearing a uniform.
That's right.
With a peaked little cap, with a little cap on it.
To try and blend in.
Well, what is not normally talked about is they said it looked a bit like a Nazi uniform.
That's right.
So where have they got? Then in the 70s, it developed into the little grey guys completely. The uniforms are gone by then. They were keeping it, and then the UFOs themselves got more and more sophisticated. And today, we don't really get flying saucers. We get flying triangles.
That's right.
So, the UFO phenomenon itself has evolved through the decades. It's changed. Now, you can ask why that is. You can make up your own theories to why that is. I don't know. But I think the ETH approach is far too simple. And the evidence doesn't fit. You're trying to put a square peg in a round hole. I think whatever the UFO phenomena is, it is far more complex than that. And it is, because that is a very simple, if you think about it, it's a simple theory. Aliens are coming from that planet to ours. By whatever means. It's a very simple thing, but it's not like that.
No.
And as I was talking... Sorry, guys, go on.
Sorry, Philip. I was just going to say, on that point, I did address this at a talk I did about them changing. They seem to be able to change their ships and their features to what is basically in vogue. It's very disturbing. They can change all manners of their, as you said, there were flying saucers, and then we had the traditional, before that, we had the flying saucers. Then we had the Nordic people, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and then the greys appear with the triangular ships. It's as if it's just changing all the time. Yes, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to just stress that point too. Yes, you're right, absolutely.
Well, not only that, if you take out the times before we had mass instant communication, you then also look at that aspect of the changing phenomena, but keep it in one era, but then look at different places around the world. And at the same time, the UFOs, all the entities, appear different to fit in with the different cultures around the world.
Yes.
For example, the Americans saw the very high-tech little grey guys. In Russia, they had, 7 foot tall, big, giant, square, masculine things. And in Britain, multicultural Britain, which it has been for, certainly since the Romans invaded, we have to remember that, we've had a bit of everything. We didn't have an identikit flying saucer or alien. We had all kinds of things. So, so not only does it alter around the decades, it alters depending on which culture you're in as well. And, I spoke to a well-known abductee, although he's never done a lot of public speaking. It's a chap called John Day. His encounter was in the late 70s at a place called Aveley in Essex, along with his wife, Sue, and their children. I won't go into it, but I spoke to John many years later, He was living in Suffolk at the time, and I went and visited him. And at the end of my interview, I said, John, look, let me just ask you this question. Is this nuts and bolts real physical phenomenon, or is it something else? And he says, Philip, he says, we as a species, that's mankind, Homo sapien, do not have the words in our vocabulary to describe these events, these encounters. He says, the way I can explain it to you is if you went to a film set, you went to Pinewood or Elstree or wherever.
Yes.
You can touch the film set, knock on it, it's physical, it's hard, it's real. But you look behind it, and it's all an illusion.
I like that.
Yeah, it's quite a profound statement, and I'm still thanking John all these years later. And I'm still trying to get my head around it, what he means. Similarly, probably the best known abductee next to Betty and Barney Hill is Whitley Strieber.
Yes. And
I hosted Whitley at a conference we did here many years back. And somebody asked him a question about, are we getting any nearer to finding out what these things are? And again, he made quite a profound statement, and he said, we're beginning to ask better questions. So in other words, the more we're learning about this phenomenon, the better questions we're asking. Yes. Because it's not as simple. I spoke to him recently, and I reminded him that, and he's just sort of chuckled. He didn't come back anyway.
I find that really incredible, Philip, because I do believe, as all of us are digging and searching and trying to find our own answers, and there's a lot of debate within UFO circles with regards to, what they believe these entities are. I do have a very strong impression that it is linked to consciousness and our souls, and I think that as we evolve as a species, that that perhaps it could be possible that this could be an extension of another realm, another world, another dimension that's been closed off to us, and that gradually, as we progress, or we try to progress as more wiser beings, that these dimensions or these alternative realities will become more focused within our psyche. But I think there is also another disturbing element that most people believe is happening. Whether or not that is disinformation or whether or not that is scare tactics or scaremongering remains to be seen. So I totally understand where you're coming from, and I have the greatest respect also for Whitley Strieber. I read his book Communion. I went out and bought a copy when it first came out. I saw him in Wogan being laughed at, and I felt sorry for the guy. But going back, Philip, to Roswell, I just got to ask you a question, because we know that's one of the most famous UFO cases of all time in American literature, and especially within the UFO community. But Ronnie was going to ask you, sorry, Ronnie, about this, but Ronnie was going to ask you, was the disc actually supposed to be saucer-shaped, or was it supposed to be of some other design?
Like a stealth fighter, there is conflicting issues. I'm just wondering if you perhaps may have gleaned a bit more information about the shape of the actual ship.
I'm fortunate that I managed to get to Roswell in 2007. And I lectured at the UFO museum there, and we also went out into the desert to the crash site. You buy a road map there of the area. The crash site is actually on the map. But there isn't one. There's several. So now the Foster Ranch, where pretty much everyone agrees something happened, it's still an awkward place to find if you don't know where you're going. I couldn't have found it without my colleague who'd been there many times. So you go back to 1947 when it didn't even have electricity. It really was. The people in Roswell have a saying that they are proud to be 200 miles from nowhere. And I think it's about 170 miles now, but they are pretty much a couple of hundred miles from nowhere. When you get out of the town, it is the desert. And, coming from Yorkshire, never seen anything like it in my life. I was amazed. But the thing about Roswell, there's a number of things. It depends on which of the Roswell researchers you talk to. Right. Now, you have Kevin Randall, you have Don Schmidt, Tom Carey, Stanton Friedman, one or two others. They all have their own different opinions, if you like, on what happened, where it happened. Stanton Friedman, for example, will tell you that there were 2 UFOs involved. and that they perhaps had a mid-air collision. And that's why you have two lots of crash sites, two lots of debris. And so it depends. And again, if you look at as you were talking about, what was the shape of the alleged UFO?
Yes.
That again has evolved down the years. And if you think about it, Roswell back in 1947 was a 15-minute sensation. It came and went in no time at all.
Oh, yes.
And it was forgotten about until 1978, when Stanton Friedman was told about Jesse Marcel, who'd been there at the time.
Yes.
And later on, they did an Unsolved Mysteries TV show, which was largely responsible for launching Roswell into the public domain. And more people came forward as a result. So, if you go back, right to the early part, I've met Marcel Jr., of course, his father showed him some of the wreckage. He's been here and stayed with us.
Oh, wow.
It's very simple wreckage. It was like these little I-beams, which I have a replica here, bits of metal, they talk about this memory metal.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much it. So it went from that. And if you compare that story to where we get to Roswell today, you think, how did we get there? We've now got this massive, what do they call it, cosmic Watergate, and this happened, and he was there, and Von Braun was involved, and it's grown hugely. It's almost like a folk tale. How it gets told and retold and retold. Each time it gets retold, it gets bigger and more elaborate. Similar with our own most famous UFO case, Rendlesham Forest, in December 1980. Now, when these lights were seen in the forest, just off base, 3 airmen were sent. They were the base security. One of them stayed with their vehicle. The 2 others went into the forest. This was John Burroughs and Jim Penniston. They found this thing. Now, Penniston will tell you that he encountered an object that was roughly triangular in shape, had red lights on top, blue lights underneath. He touched it. It felt warm. It was smooth, and it had these big hieroglyphic markings on the side of it, and he walked around it. But his friend and colleague, John Burroughs, who was stood just a few feet away, said, all I saw was some funny lights. I never saw him touch anything. I never saw him walk around anything. I didn't see no craft. So it went from a few funny lights in the forest to where we have Rendlesham today now, where, everything has happened, And Jim Penniston now claims that this was a vehicle from our future. So this was a time traveling vehicle that had malfunctioned, and when he touched it, it downloaded this binary code into him, which he went home and wrote in his, he never told anybody about it at the time, by the way. I don't think he did. So it's gone from a few funny lights in the forest to a time machine from Earth's future. Yeah, I mean, I think that, these things are influenced by culture, folklore, confabulation. I don't think UFO researchers take that into account. Certainly nowhere near enough. It's not lying. I'm not saying something puzzling didn't happen in Rendlesham Forest. I'm not saying something bizarre didn't happen in Roswell. But, if you go back and look at the early stories of Robin Hood, for example, it's a folk tale. He didn't really exist. But now you have, you had Russell Crowe playing Robin Hood. I saw Russell Crowe play Noah. And Noah's a kung fu expert. He's kicking 7 bells out of people. I didn't read any of that in the Bible. Noah was a peace-loving guy. That's why he was chosen.
Yep.
We try. Or certainly some people, and I would just say in paranormal as well, they try and pigeonhole. This is UFOs. This is a paranormal. That's folklore. This is mysticism. This is legend. Well, in fact, it's not. It's a mixture of all of these things. And that's what we have to try and decipher, to try and get to the core of what really did take place. And it's extremely difficult at times.
Yes.
Most UFO researchers, most paranormal researchers are like me. They are self-funded. We haven't had any training. And I've got to be fair and honest, I think because of that, I think we do a pretty good job most of the time.
Yeah, darling job.
we are fallible. We make mistakes. I've trekked all over this damn country interviewing people, on my own dollar, as the Americans say. But in other words, I was self-funded and still am, as are paranormal researchers, vast majority of them.
Yes.
So it's not as straightforward and as easy as we wouldn't imagine. I've kind of lost your question there. Going back to Roswell, what fascinates me about Roswell is if you go right back to the very beginning, the airbase there did issue a press release saying they found bits of a flying disc and it was being flown to higher headquarters. Within hours, that was withdrawn and they said, sorry, weather balloon.
Yes.
And the story died there. If we are to believe the Roswell idea as it is now, that this was some kind of cover-up that was put in place, then how did we go from a flying disc to a cover-up in just a matter of hours?
That's right.
How did we identify something that they're claiming is alien technology, something that not only had to be instantly covered up there and then, but has subsequently had to be kept covered up ever since?
Yeah.
This is alien technology.
Yes, I believe it did happen. I do, and I think something did crash there, something alien. It's just that, as we said, the getting first-hand information is now impossible because I think most of the people have sadly passed, haven't they? So
I met Jesse Marcel Jr. and I don't doubt a word he has to say, and I'm not doubting any of the others. All I'm saying is, what happened that would make the cosmic cover-up in a very short period of time? The way I look at it is that in 1947, the Cold War was really hotting up.
Yes.
It was really starting to get underway. Now, if you'd been the American president at the time, then if Roswell had been an ET crash landing, the propaganda that you could have got from that would have been, you could not have bought it. You could have said to the Ruskies, right, the first contact with an alien species, they came to America. Sadly, they had an accident, and then, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Not only have we got our nukes, guys, guess what these guys left behind? You could do up there. I mean, propaganda you could get from it would be sensational. Yes. Like all politicians, they like to leave their name in history. Can you imagine if you'd been the first one ever to announce first contact? There would be statues of you here, there, and everywhere, not just in parts of America, but
Yes.
And that didn't happen, and that's always puzzled me.
Yes.
And so I don't know. My answer is I don't know. What I do know is that the location where it happened is, as people have described it, only worse. It is still an out-of-the-way place to get to. We drove out of Roswell on the normal road, and then my friend who was taking me there started swearing because we'd gone past the turning. Anyway, we took the turning, and he says we turn left at mile marker 17, and it is literally a pole at the side of the road that says number 17 on it. And we're on the road to Socorro, and when you get through there, it is just a dirt road. And if you don't know where you go, we had to stop at one point because the road had gone. They have flash floods. We had to take another little route. And it is still an awkward place to find even today. And it was even more out of the way. But, things with Roswell do crop up. I mean, a few years ago, I was contacted by a chap who run a little film company in America called White Tiger Films. And he said what they like to do at White Tiger Films is take real-life stories and make them into like a TV movie.
Yeah.
One of his clients had been a private investigator. Apparently, she was a very well-known private investigator in the US, but she died, and her son and daughter had been going through her files, and they found one marked Roswell. And in it was an interview with a chap called Charles Forgus, and a video, a VHS cassette videotape of an interview with him. And this was and nobody had ever heard of this old boy. He was indeed in the military during the war. After that, he went into law enforcement, and did become a deputy sheriff. And the story in this, that he says on video and in the transcripted interview, is that in 1947, he wasn't in Roswell. He was at a place called Big Springs, Texas. And he was with the sheriff, and they'd been looking for a guy who'd been cashing false checks. And the sheriff down in Roswell had got him, and had got him in the nick. So they made arrangements to go and pick him up. And en route, he claims that they heard about this crash on the police radio. So they took a detour, found this location. The military were there. They saw this craft with the creatures. They were not forcibly told to go away, but they were, told that you shouldn't be here. So off they went, got their prisoner, and, hightailed it back to Big Springs, Texas. And, none of the main Roswell researchers thought this was credible, so we published the story. It went around the world, and lo and behold, first to pop up was a nephew of the late Charles Forgus, this old boy we knew was dead, but his nephew popped up. He says, I don't know anything about that story. All I can tell you is that, yes, my uncle was in the police force. He was an honourable man. And then, lo and behold, one of the late Charles Forgus' son located us. And he said, my father told me about this back in the early 1950s, which was long before anyone knew anything about Roswell. Wow. And he says, the reason I know it was the 1950s is because we actually moved house but it was a big move, from one state to another. So I know roughly when that was. And he said, my father told me about it, and I mentioned it just a couple of times. Wow. So there you go.
Well, do you know what? That is absolutely incredible. I've just been sitting here, and my brother, where he is obviously the same, mesmerised by your research, your books, your experiences. Been wonderful. Yeah. So, Philip, tell us how can people get hold of you? Like, they wouldn't know how to anyway, but because you're so well known. But how can people get hold of you?
Yeah, I'm on Facebook, like half the planet is. Yeah. Or if you just type Flying Disc Press into Google, I've got a blog. You'll find me there, and there's a way to contact me via the blog. I'm always more than happy to hear from people. Just email me; it's not a problem. And stuff falls in my inbox from all over the place. It really does. I never know what's going to be there from one day to the next. We've just signed a deal with a German publisher. We've managed to get a couple of our books published in Russia. Brilliant. Yeah, they're coming out in September. Wow. So, and there's more books in the pipeline. I'm working on another book of my own at the moment. So yeah, there's always something new. I don't have a proper job anymore.
Well, as I said, you've got to spend some time. And I tell you what, like us, I enjoy doing it. I like yourself. I really enjoy it. I love it. It is frustrating, but it's also fascinating. And it's people like you, Philip, who has always held a light up for other researchers, other investigators, other authors, a shining example of what can be done, what can be achieved. You have to be commended. And we would like you at some point, maybe in the late future, for you to come back on the show to give us an update of what's been going on. Would that be okay?
Oh, absolutely. Any time, gentlemen, any time at all. And what I would say to any of your listeners, if they're thinking about getting involved in any form of research, then go for it. There's a big wide world out there, and it is fascinating. It really is. I'm just a daft lad from a little mining town, little mining village, no qualifications, and this subject has enhanced my life no end, and it's taken me around the world and taken me to places I could never have dreamt of.
Brilliant. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've been listening to Philip Mantle, who is an esteemed author and a paranormal investigator. And you've been listening to Twin Souls in association with the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Thank you for tuning in and listening. And we thank Philip also for coming on board, and Ronald for coming on board with us as well. He normally is there.
Yeah, and, it's been an honour having Philip Mantle on here. It's an absolute honour.
Thank you very much, Philip.
My pleasure.
God bless. Thank you very much.